Recorded. Welcome to the RespectAbility webinar, Jewish Inclusion Public Opinion Research. Your speakers for today's program are Linda Berger, Executive Director of the Jewish Family Service in Houston, and Megan Buren, Vice President of Research and Communications at RespectAbility. Audiocast quality is subject to your equipment, available bandwidth, and internet traffic. If you experience unsatisfactory audio quality, please use the telephone dial-in option provided in your confirmation and reminder emails. Captions today can be turned off or repositioned by clicking on the gray circle in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation screen. If you have dialed in, operator assistance is available by pressing £0. A handout of today's slide presentation can be downloaded using the Program Materials link in your confirmation and reminder emails or from the Documents folder on the lower right of the presentation screen. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. I will now turn the call over to Jennifer Mizrahi, President of RespectAbility. Please begin.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. As I see who's dialed in, we have quite a range of wonderful people, experts who've been working in this field for some time, and new people who are just learning about it for the first time. This is a research project that we did because we had some particular needs that we're trying to expand really the movement of inclusion of Jews with disabilities in Jewish life. And we have consistently found that we're having difficulty getting traction amongst those that are not immediately impacted by disability issues. So there were some very serious questions about how do we get people excited? How do we get them motivated? And what's really going to work for us? In looking at this, we are very delighted that we had the support of the Alexander Institute for Inclusion, and I want to especially thank Joan Alexander and her husband and family for their support, along with the ongoing support that we've been getting from the Ruderman Family Foundation to really work towards inclusion in the Jewish community. I'm going to start by turning this over to Linda Berger, who is really a mentor of mine in this Jewish inclusion movement. And in fact, as I was transitioning into this field, it was she and Joan Alexander who spoke at a Jewish Funders Network conference who first got me excited about working professionally in this field. So it seems particularly appropriate to have her with us today. Linda, thanks for joining us, and thanks for being such a key partner in this work.
Jennifer, thank you very much. I'm honored by what you just said, and I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation. First, we have been doing this what seems like a very long time, but honestly it's less than a decade and probably more like 5 serious years of trying to get congregations and institutions involved in the inclusion of people with disabilities. So I wanted to say at the offset that it was a great privilege to be invited to listen to the 2 focus groups that took place and comprise today's conversation. I'm really grateful to the focus group participants who were very open and helped us learn a lot about the work we have still to do in the area of inclusion of people with disabilities. It was painful at times, I have to admit, but it was mostly instructive, and I'm sure that it will inform the way we are working here in Houston. It enforced to me that we still have a job to do, and I believe the entire country still has a job to do to strengthen families with disabilities and their loved ones. I learned a lot about Jewish text, by the way. I don't know if Megan will be speaking about this, but we found that Jewish text, Hebrew text, did not really resonate with the individuals in the focus groups. And of course, whenever we're marketing anything here in Houston, we always think first of the values that inform what we do. And we took away a great learning about that, we still care about what the text says, but we'll have to think more carefully about how we brand the work we're doing. I think that probably what I learned, the biggest learning was that before we can really be successful with inclusion, people with disabilities must be visible. And it's more like a civil rights issue than it is simply asking individuals in the institutions to involve and include people. And I think we're going to have to work hard with the families and the persons with disabilities to want to be visible, number one, and then to begin to think about what it is they really want to happen in the community, and then provide the support to them so that they can be visible in all walks of Jewish life. So I think at the end of the day, I learned about that partnership, and I am viewing inclusion just a little bit differently than I was before. So I want to turn it over to Megan, who will tell you much more about the details, and then at the end I may have a couple of things to say.
Great. Linda, thank you so much. And again, let me echo as Jennifer said, thank you for your partnership and the partnership that we had in Houston. It was incredibly important to the project and making sure that we got it done right. So I'll start with just a little bit of background on what this research built upon. This wasn't the first time that RespectAbility or myself or Jennifer have looked to do public opinion research on the topic of disability inclusion. We've done focus groups twice now of Capitol Hill congressional staffers looking more at employment issues. We've done focus group of people with disabilities who are looking for work, in addition to parents and providers for people with disabilities who are looking for employment. And then this round started with qualitative research, which was focus groups of Jewish parents with no personal connection to disability in Maryland, and then followed by another focus group of the same makeup of individuals in Houston. In addition, we've done polling, extensive polling on this topic, first with Jerusalem University of Young Engaged Jews, nationwide of the disability community. Under an earlier company with Laszlo Strategies, we did a very large mapping project of disability services and attitudes for the Foundation for Jewish Camps, Senate Battleground States, a nationwide survey, and then on this round, a nationwide survey of American Jews. So this is not our first step into this world from a research perspective, so we really had a lot to base this study on, and this focused specifically on attitudes within the Jewish community, and then how could we possibly speak to those individuals in order to make them more engaged, more motivated, more excited about this issue. So I will start with just a little glimpse into two of the earlier polls. The first was from Jerusalem University. This was 2,607 Jews, and what you can see up against a battery of different options was that Jewish events and organizations should be as welcoming and inclusive of people with disabilities as everyone else. Overwhelming agreement with that statement. And so, you're up at 98% agreement, 89% strongly agree, very strong support among a younger generation, up against other statements about Jewish life that they felt strongly about, but not as strongly. So when we look at numbers like this, it leads us to think, if people feel so strongly that this should be happening, why aren't we seeing more of it? And so we needed to go further. The next that I'll point out comes from the survey that we did with Foundation for Jewish Camps. And I have to take a second before even explaining the question that's on here to hold the Foundation for Jewish Camp up as a real model of walking the walk, talking the talk, and taking all of the right steps to really be a leader in inclusion. They've made a an intentional decision that inclusion is going to be part of their model, and making Jewish camping more inclusive for people with disabilities a central part of the work that they do. And so from our perspective, just incredibly grateful, and to hold them up really as a leader of, if people make the decision that this is what's going to happen, the tremendous amount of change that can come from that decision. So on this, what you see is we ask that even if none are exactly right, which statement comes closest to your views of serving children with disabilities / special needs at your camp. And you can see that 56%, so over half of the respondents said including campers with disabilities and special needs is a meaningful and intentional component of our camp community. We value the impact on our staff and campers with and without disabilities. But you also see 27% in the first yellow box that are open and honest and saying we're interested in doing more, but we're not properly staffed or funded, and we're nervous about all that it entails. Another 6% saying that these campers are often more comfortable and served best in a camp that is just for kids with disabilities. And another 3% on top of that saying that it has a negative impact. So when you look at these numbers, it lets us know that there is real room for improvement in moving in the right direction. And we've seen, like I said, FJC take huge strides in that area, and what we're looking to do is build the same type of momentum in the rest of the community. So what did we do when we started out for these focus groups? In DC and Houston, the people in the room were parents with children, parents who still had children at home who were under 15. The family, meaning the parents and the children, were engaged in Jewish life across a number of different areas, and many of these parents even held leadership positions in the Jewish community. They also did not self-identify as personally having a disability, having a child or a family member with a disability, or even a close friend with a disability. And so they self-identified as a group that was not impacted personally by disability issues. And I'll speak about what we found later in the groups, but that was how they made it into this discussion. They were fielded blind by the focus group facility, so they did not know that that Houston JFS or that RespectAbility were behind the study, and they came to have this discussion. Within the focus group, like many others, we walked them through a guided conversation about these issues, which involved worksheets on what were the barriers to inclusion, what potential terminology they were comfortable, and what were the words and images that might make them feel more motivated and more engaged on this issue. And what I have here is a small compilation of some of the verbatim statements that came out of these groups, and it highlights what we heard throughout. So the first one, I don't want to write any more checks. There is a sense among the people that we spoke to that a lot of inclusion work can be very expensive, and that whatever was coming out of this was another fundraising campaign where there was going to be yet another ask for yet another check. And so there is a feeling that this is expensive, and that is what is coming next. Secondly, what you saw is in the second bullet, I just do not think that there is a problem within the Jewish community that is tied to disabled Jews. There is no need. So I'll focus first on that first part of the statement, and you'll see it later in the findings and Linda already referenced, that if there isn't a visible problem, then there isn't a problem. So there was a real lack of understanding that there was a need. So the perception was either there aren't that many people that actually have a disability and need anything changed to be included, because we don't see them, or this is already taken care of because otherwise we would hear about it. And so there isn't a perception of there being a need. And then in addition, what you see in the next bullet is that a lot of disabilities are specific and need specific ways to be addressed. It's almost impossible to have a school that handles all of these things. It takes one teacher per child, and that's impossible. It's a lot for Jewish schools to handle. So this concept that it's too complicated, we can't serve everyone, those types of sentiments came up over and over again the further that we got into it. On the next page of verbatims, the top two, there was a sense that for these people, they felt that families of children with disabilities tried to hide the fact that there was a disability in their family. They tried to hide the kid, meaning the family was the one that was not inclusive. They tried to protect the children from, quote unquote, being embarrassed in public. And so these were, and there was not, and I will say that I pushed on this in one of the groups. They were not willing to go to a place for the majority of them where they would say these children were potentially being embarrassed because the action of the community in their reaction to the child was wrong. What was wrong was the parent in this situation. And so this came out in the conversation. I wanted to highlight it as one of the sentiments, not the only, but one. There is a sense that that Jews should do this better, and that there are many other fronts other areas where Jews have been incredibly successful, and that we're probably doing better than other faiths. And so you see that in the next statement. And lastly, I'll point out that they've come back to the point that you have to be realistic about what the expectations are based on what's available, and a sentiment that you should have sympathy and empathy, right? So it isn't a conversation about inclusion and abilities, it's a conversation about need and help and sympathy and empathy, which isn't the framing that we think will be most helpful or most appropriate for this discussion moving forward. So this is just an example of the type of worksheet that we used. This is a list of statements on why inclusion of Jews with disabilities should be a top priority for the community. And we won't go through all of these here because we put the winners, so to speak, from this on the poll, where you'll have more statistical significance of what was the top messages to gain support from the Jewish community for inclusion. So this is just an example of the type of worksheet that we do within the focus group, and then have a discussion around it. Why did they react the way that they did to, the quote-unquote religious arguments of we're all created in the image of God? Or, why did they not understand, or why was it not impactful that fully 18.6% of Americans have a disability? Why did that not resonate for them, that there are so many people in the community who are impacted? So that's the way in which we have the conversation around these worksheets.
Wait, let me just jump in and say that the first number is the positive number. That's the number of people who thought that a particular message was particularly significant in positive, and it moved them towards thinking that inclusion was important. And if there's a negative number, that reflects the number of people who thought this was one of the worst reasons or the weakest arguments for being for inclusion. And so I did think, this is Jennifer speaking, that we did see that throughout the Jewish community, the most common way of really pitching inclusion was through our religious tenets, things like, that all people are created in the image of God, equal spark of God, et cetera, Moses with a speech impediment. The religious framing was really how the community has been marketing, quote unquote, inclusion significantly historically, and it really did fall flat in both groups. It proved not to be even close to the most effective argument.
Right, and we will see the same on the poll. The other thing that I want to point out is that there's a very large list of partners that had input into what are the potential arguments that we should be using. What are the words that they're using in their organizations? What do they think is the best thing that we should be saying? And so this is a compilation of input from many, many different partner groups who were very helpful to share their, their wisdom and their ideas with us so that ideally we can get to the best answer for the whole community to share. So key findings from the focus group rounds. One is there is a real lack of knowledge I've already touched on, and awareness. If people aren't seen, it's because there isn't a need or the need is already taken care of. So that's one, I would say the very first barrier that we really come up against is there is no large understanding or knowledge of the fact that there's even an issue, right? And Jennifer spoke about the religious messaging. It does appear to pop, and we see from the poll, with a more religious audience, but it has the opposite effect with many other Jews. And if you think about the way in which a lot of Jews connect these days, it's a much more cultural connection than observance connection. And the same holds true here. So if a Jew isn't a Jew by connecting to, walking to synagogue on Shabbos morning and, doing things very, very traditionally and following those types of observances, then what will connect to them about including a person with disabilities is not to say that they aren't included in that way, because it isn't something that they connect to. And so that makes sense with a lot of other research that we've seen about how Jews are Jewish today, and the same holds here with messaging and with images. So the limited knowledge that we reference in terms of an awareness about this issue focuses very much on programs and places. There doesn't seem to be a larger understanding of inclusion, of building an inclusive community and what that would mean for people with disabilities. It's services and programs is the way in which the knowledge is currently cataloged. So when you ask people about what they know about inclusion, they'll reference that program at JFS, or this thing that happens at that synagogue, or this that happens at that day school. It's very isolated and segmented in terms of what's the program and where is the place that it happens, rather than a larger understanding of inclusion. In addition to the religious message that we have been, selling for so long on this topic, a lot of the framing to donors has been one of need and help, or at least that's the way in which it is perceived on the donor end, right? So there's a need to write a check for this, for people that are in need, for people that need your help. And it's not based on a conversation of inclusion and the value of individuals. And it feeds into that sympathy and empathy sentiment that I spoke on a minute ago. We have an ongoing issue, however, that even though they don't know the scope of the problem, when they're confronted with real numbers on the scope of the problem, it does not seem credible, right? So we know what the numbers are within the American community. We understand why within the Jewish community, because of links to paternal age and others, that in all likelihood in the Jewish community, the incidence of disability is even higher than it would be across the average American population. It's not credible to them that at least 1 in 5 Jews has a disability. And so we face an ongoing issue with expanding the knowledge of what the scope is, because they don't buy what the scope actually is when presented.
The definition that we're using for disability is the U.S. Census Bureau definition, something that would impact something that's in your life. So I see that people are asking us. So mental health, or autism or physical disability, all of these would be included in disability. So it's the U.S. Census Bureau has it as 18.6% of Americans have a disability, and that is the definition that we were using.
Thank you. So there is a tendency among this group, at least, to want to, quote unquote, fix the problem in these limited, targeted ways. So we should host a fundraiser, we should establish a school, we should figure out how to, quote unquote, fix the problem, rather than a tendency to look at this in a more holistic manner that deals with real inclusion. And adding on to that, right, if you understand that that's the tendency, then the idea that we can just write a check and, and have an answer, write a check and fix the problem, is a tendency that we see in these groups. There was not a real discussion of the abilities of people with disabilities or the value of people with disabilities. As I mentioned earlier, there's certainly a concern about cost and a concern about the inability to serve everyone, and what would that really mean if we had to make everything equal for every single individual, and a rejection and a defensiveness that the community is at fault for a lack of inclusion, right? When messages were put in a way that put the fault on the larger community, there was a real pushback against that. And so one of the things to think about when we talk about messaging for more inclusion was that what were most powerful were uplifting. They were inspirational. They were value-based. They talked about the community that we all want, making everyone, if you think about that, the central character of the ask. Right? We're now asking for a community that benefits everyone, rather than saying you should do this because this segment of the population needs this, or this segment of the population has been excluded, in a more setting up an us and them scenario that puts people on the defensive, by making it instead about all of us in a positive and uplifting and value-based manner. People were far more receptive to this type of message. Now, moving on to the polling results, we did see concern about increasing inclusion of Jews with disabilities. When you look at sort of the intensity of that concern, though, with extremely concerned being at 18.5%, it's not very high. They're somewhat concerned about it. But you also see, like I said, in terms of this lack of awareness or understanding, 14% that really doesn't know, and another 26% that isn't concerned, when you add up not very concerned and not at all concerned. And so there's clearly room for improvement, and there isn't a whole lot of intensity on the concern level that we do have. Looking at the barriers to fully including more Jews with disabilities in the community, the first, when they were given two choices, so they can answer their first choice, and then we also asked them, and what would be your second choice? So there are two columns here that you can see on their first choice here and their second choice down the second column. 31% said there's a prejudice and stigma against people with disabilities and their value to the community. So that's nearly a third on the first choice that are mentioning that. What I should say, though, is coupled with the research that we did from the focus groups, it seems that while there's a recognition that there's prejudice and stigma, it isn't my prejudice and stigma. So it's there, but I'm not prejudiced, is the sense that we came away with from the focus groups. And so at least there's a recognition that it's there, but it's not a very personal, it's not a personal indictment and shouldn't be read in that way. But followed by that, in the first choice, there aren't many people. Again, we see a lack of an understanding of the scope of the issue, and then including people would be complicated and we don't have the expertise. And I should have mentioned before that is other emergencies and communal needs are more pressing, so why this isn't a top priority. And when you go into their second choice and they get to add, that's where you see this is a resource issue, right? Other issues are more pressing. And then secondly, it's complicated and we don't have the ability to serve everyone in the community. Those are the two choices that become the second choice runner-up, if you will, on what is the biggest barrier to including more Jews with disabilities. So it's important for us to understand what people perceive to be the barriers before we can work to overcome those barriers. Otherwise, we're not sure, what fight we're fighting. So moving on to what's the most convincing statement on why inclusion of Jews with disabilities should be a more important priority for the Jewish community. And these were the two overwhelming winners in what we gave them as an answer. And this responds to what I said a moment ago about strong, uplifting, communal, value-based messages being the ones that are most powerful. So the first is we are a stronger community when we live up to our values, when we are welcoming, diverse, moral, and respect one another. We want our children, parents, grandparents, and other family and friends with disabilities to be able to have an equal opportunity to fully participate in our community. So that's the first. And the second, not far behind, is Jewish people with disabilities and their families have the same hopes and dreams as everyone else, even if they face different challenges. We should ensure that everyone knows that their presence and participation is welcome and meaningful to all of us. And so you see that those two reflect that same idea of how they are framed. Here, down at 12.5% is what we would say is the religious message that B'Tselem Elokim Bara'oto, that everyone is created equal and in the image of God. It references Moses and Jacob and Isaac, and that one was, less than half as powerful as the other ones that we just spoke about. The other thing that I should mention, and this is 6.9%, we spend a lot of time and effort to attract and retain Jews to be engaged in Jewish life. As we do this, we should be mindful that there are many Jews with disabilities who already want to be involved and are having a challenging time. Again, it in some ways put people on the defensive, and the idea that the future of Jewish engagement will be saved in this way didn't really go with the focus groups that we saw. And so the idea that the Pew report and coming back at that from a negative angle of we're losing people because we are excluding families with disabilities was framed in a negative way that was not impactful to the audience that we're trying to reach. And so these are the two strongest messages, and we would encourage you to look at them not just as a sentence, but as a concept that you can build your own conversation, your own marketing materials, your own invitations around.
Can you go back to 16 for a moment, Megan, if you don't mind? This is Jennifer jumping in. I think it's really important to understand that message is a resource to a Jewish organization, that it is just as important as money, as an asset. So that when you communicate with your headlines, with your speeches, with your blogs, with your Facebooks, whatever it is, what you see very clearly in the data is that this universal, we as a community are stronger when we live up to our values, this welcoming big tent message tests 3 times better than the 2 messages that we are using the most, which is the religious message and the demographic message. Also, this message of just like everyone else, equal rights, just like everyone else, is 3 times more successful as a message almost than the messages that we have been using. And I would like to flag that it says, has the same hopes and dreams as everyone else or anyone else. That is something that we got frankly, from the gay rights movement in terms of marriage equality, because it used to be that the gay community talked about gay marriage, but then they discovered that that sounded like a special need or a set-aside or a special thing, and they changed it to marriage equality, wanting the same rights that everybody else had, and all of a sudden the poll numbers went up very, very significantly. This is a very important thing to understand because public opinion about Jewish things is related to how people are finding information and processing it in the larger community. Right now, we live in a society that has quite a lot of partisan bickering in Washington, and we see ISIS attacking and murdering people on television and on YouTube because people have different values than they have. So people overall are very much looking for unifying, welcoming, accepting communities. So I would not be surprised if you were to go out and try and sell, how would you sell that interfaith families could be more included or LGBTQ families should be more included, that you would find that these same messages would probably test the best for those as well, and indeed that we should be looking to hook our wagon to their interests also. I know at the Foundation for Jewish Camp, for example, they're working with Russian immigrants, with the second generation of Jewish Russian immigrants, that all of this links together in terms of whether it's a single parent family, that people are really looking for welcoming, inclusive, big tent, respectful, diverse experiences.
Right.
Thanks, Megan. Next slide.
No problem. And the other thing just to recognize again is these use the word we, right? It's about all of us, and I think that that's very important when you look at that as well.
Yep.
So what are the words that make you feel most positive? So the most positive, it builds again on the same concepts: welcoming, respect, and inclusion. What are the things that make them feel most positive about including more Jews with disabilities in our community? And we looked to our own answers. We looked to answers that we got from the focus groups to include on this list. So this is pared down from what it originally was, but you can see that the same concepts are translating across all of these different questions. We also asked on this poll whether or not the person answering had a disability, had a family member or a close friend, or themselves had a disability. They were allowed to answer, more than one. And so what you see, 51%, none of the above. But what that means is that roughly half of the community, which jives with other polling research that we've seen on the scope of disability, this is specifically of Jews, that half of Jews are in some way impacted by disability. And what was interesting in the groups was that, like I said, people self-identified as not having a family member with a disability or a close friend with a disability, but the more that we got into the conversation, different things come up. Oh, my kid needed this service at school and had this, or now my father who's elderly is using a wheelchair. And so it's interesting that while the term wasn't a term that they identified with, that someone in their family had a disability, that a lot of people are connected to disability and haven't even registered it in that way, that this impacts their lives as well. And so this gives you just a sense of the numbers, and with 30% saying that they have a family member with a disability. The pictures were very interesting. Those that worked were inclusive, right? So you see people in these pictures who are actively being included and are part of the community. And so respondents really liked the one on the right here, the two young men who were happy, who appeared to be friends, appeared to be at some type of an athletic event that they were excited about. And we thank Team Yachad and Yachad for allowing us to use this image that came from the Miami Marathon. So this sense that they were included, they were excited, they were happy, they were friends, and it wasn't something that was inherently Jewish in terms of religious observance. This one on the left, I'll give a caveat. This came, and we thank the Masorti movement and the work that they're doing in Israel for children with disabilities to have bar and bat mitzvahs. This came from them, and this was the most powerful on the poll. And I'll give the caveat that that while observant religious images seem generally not to be the best bet, it would seem that this one, because of how widespread the bar and bat mitzvah are in our community, might fit within, more of a cultural frame rather than lighting candles and, making blessings and those types of things that are considered traditional observance. So it is a religious picture, and I realize that flies against some of what we said before, but it seems that it might fit within the cultural Judaism that we referenced, and this was the winner from the poll of the best images. What didn't work in the images were when there were people with disabilities who were alone, when it seemed staged, and when there was religious observance, because the focus groups loved this girl. They thought she was, beautiful and happy, and she's wonderful. They didn't give a positive sense about inclusion for those reasons. And so when you think about the images that go along with the messaging that you'll use to promote inclusion of Jews with disabilities, those are some guidelines to stick with, that they be really truly included and happy and part of a Jewish community that isn't just focused on Jewish observance. So I'll go back again to leave up here the what we said, winning messages from the poll. And as Jennifer stated, this really is something that can and should be used widely. This is not just a sentence. This is an idea. This is a frame. And if you know that these are quote unquote your winning hand, then you want to use them over and over again. It's like having an ace in your pocket. And so the work that we're doing can be that much more effective when we use the right images and the right messages and the right words to go along with all of our best intention and best resources. Included at the end of the file that you've downloaded, there are a few other slides. One is a new brochure that we've put together on building a welcoming community for all, that's based off of these new messages that we found on the poll, that you can download by clicking on the Click Here button at the top of the screen. And then this is also followed by our information about how you can see more on Jewish inclusion from RespectAbility. There's a new Facebook page and Twitter on the work that RespectAbility is doing, just focused on Jewish inclusion. And then beyond that, if you're interested, there are appendices of the worksheets that we used for both the groups in DC and Houston. So I will pause there and ask our other speakers to join us and answer any questions.
So Megan, it's Linda, and I did want to just say a couple of things. First place, it's amazing, the work that you have done, and I said in the beginning it was painful to observe the focus groups, and I have to say it was painful again to listen to this. And it's painful because I think all of us on the call, either as advocates or as individuals with disabilities or parents of individuals with disabilities, are thinking, what do we have to do? I mean, this is a battle that's a 24/7 battle for many people, and it was really painful to listen to a second time. I think what I'm amazed by is what I will call the resilience of advocates, because it takes that resilience to get kind of shot down by the painful thinking of people, and then to be able to get up again and go about your daily battles. A couple of times we've talked about issues as it relates to the civil rights movement. And I just keep thinking about it in particular since this is the 25th anniversary of the ADA legislation. And recently we met with some advocates who literally 25 years ago went in their wheelchairs, got out of them, and got themselves up the steps at the Capitol and really had a strong voice in the challenges they faced without the legislation that the ADA brought into play. And I think when it comes to inclusion in our Jewish communities, we have to think like that, almost like warriors who are ready for battle, and sometimes the battles are quietly played out in offices and in public places, and sometimes we have to all come together and really make statements. And I think that's, again, what I walked away with is we need to pick where we want to make the statements so that what seems invisible becomes visible.
Thank you, Linda. We're going to start taking questions, and the operator will let people do it on the phone. But we have a couple of them that are here online that people have typed in. Zohar asks, have you or anyone else done a study asking whether Jewish institutions who are inclusive fare better in any way than those who are not inclusive? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that says that inclusive institutions fare better. But in terms of there being a systematic study, I have yet to see one. But I'm very delighted that RespectAbility was chosen by the New York Jewish Federation to do a deep inclusion project with 7 synagogues that we are just starting to undertake, and that they have engaged some really expert evaluators from the outside who are going to be taking a look at some of these issues. I think it is important to see. I mean, we have seen, from, I don't know if you saw the Eva Steen op-ed about the collateral good that came out of inclusion at the synagogue in New York that just did it recently. But you do see that there's a lot of groups that feel better. And certainly at the Foundation for Jewish Camp, particularly when I take a look at the New Jersey Y situation where they had 1,000 kids in a camp that really did not include kids with disabilities, and then they had a separate segregated camp with 100 kids that did have disabilities, and that they had been operating separately for many years. And then this past summer they integrated, and the 100 kids with disabilities then moved into the camp with 1,000 kids without disabilities. And the CEO, Len, who runs the camp, did an extraordinary job. And every report that I got said that the camp was much better off, both for the kids with the disabilities, but interestingly, also for the kids without the disabilities, that it was much more successful for everyone. I think that the work the Foundation for Jewish Camp is doing is ahead of the other movements, and we'll start to see that. But change doesn't happen overnight. People have to decide that they want to do inclusion. Then they need to have the right resources. They need to build the trust with the parents, for example. They need to have an open trust with the people they're working with. That's why when we put out the brochure that is at the end of this that you can click on and download, there are actual tips, because it's not like you snap your fingers and overnight inclusion happens. It's about things like aid and fade, that it's not that you have a child go into a Jewish congregational school or a day school or a camp and they get a big brother and their big brother is their only relationship. No, their extra camp counselor or madrik helps them make peer relationships with their typically developing teens, which is good for the typically developing teen and good for the person with the disability. But these are some profound changes that don't happen overnight. So I am looking forward to seeing the study that will be done through this UJA Federation of New York project that we've just started to undergo. Charles Auerbach and members of his team will be leading the report on it, but it's going to be 2 years before we actually complete the project and the evaluation is completely done. Operator, you want to announce how people can ask their questions verbally?
Participants who have dialed in for audio can indicate that they'd like to ask a question or speak by pressing 7#. That's 7 followed by the pound sign on their phone.
And
Please
while
listen.
we're waiting on that, I'll answer Sarah S. asked about how disability was defined for the people in the focus groups. So I'll answer that in the meantime. And we purposefully did not define disability for the people that were in the focus groups. And it was actually interesting to watch them really struggle with that concept of what does disability actually mean to them, what does it look like to them, who does it impact. And I think that it's interesting, and it goes back to the same concept, I think, of how do we fix the problem, right? And that was one of the reasons that it was so hard for them to say, well, we could do inclusion this way or we could do that, but it depends. It really depends. It depends on who the person is. It depends on, is it a person in a wheelchair who has no cognitive disability? Is it a person who needs a one-on-one aid? The reason that it appeared that there was this struggle was because of their need to fix the problem. And so we purposefully did not define it for them, but that was, I think, an interesting finding in and of itself.
And let me read out loud this question that just came in. Have you looked at possibly reframing to include aging population? Often people think of inclusion in terms of children. I'm seeing many older congregants dropping from sight. If we included them in the message, it may resonate more. Linda or Megan, you want to take that?
I'll let Linda go first. Jennifer, I think that there might be differing views on this. So we'll let Linda go, and then Jennifer, you're probably best to follow.
So in the very beginning, we defined in Houston disability as everything that didn't have to do with the natural process of aging. And of course, we're beginning to learn and to understand that it happens all the way through life. And so I think it should also focus on individuals who are older and who you're seeing drop out. As a matter of fact, one of the synagogues in Houston, Congregation Beth Yeshurun, the very first big inclusion project they did really focused in on people with dementia and memory care and memory loss challenges. And, you know, I wasn't thinking that should be the first project, but it was, and they were right. They're very successful with 60 people participating monthly in that program and being included in the congregational life because of it. So absolutely.
Megan?
We think that there is a real value in adding that on, in making sure that people understand just how broadly this goes and the age that, you know, when you find somebody in the focus group who's saying, now my elderly father has this, or my elderly father or my elderly mother, you know, is hard of hearing, there we think is a real potential value in broadening this so that people understand that it really is impacting their own lives. And you know, do you want your, you know, your child's grandparent to be able to get up on the bima at that bar mitzvah, or to be able to get into the sanctuary to see that consecration? So there seems to be a real value for opening that up and for coupling that with this messaging.
Demographically, the way disability breaks out is that disability, physical disability, is extremely uncommon in children. So very few children are wheelchair users, very few children are blind or deaf, for example. Those are things that are acquired disabilities over time. What is more common for children is social skills, is autism, or cognitive disabilities, you know, our learning differences, learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, et cetera, So, and interestingly, those are disabilities that frequently you cannot see. And so somebody may see a child behaving in what they consider an unexpected way and say, look at that child is misbehaving, as opposed to saying, look at that child is experiencing sensory overload because of the ruach of the loud singing in the congregation. Is there a way that we could allow that family to enable that child to participate, even though there are times it gets louder, for example. And so there are different kinds of disabilities that happened along the lifespan. I will say that it is cheaper to deal frequently with the kinds of disabilities that don't require rebuilding a building to be ADA standards. But there's a reason to do it for everyone, and something people did find compelling was that when there's a bar bat mitzvah, that the grandfather who's the wheelchair user should be able to be on the bima with their child who might be on the autism spectrum, that they saw value in both things.
It looks like we have two people who are waiting to speak.
Okay, go ahead.
Alyssa, please add your comment.
Hi, this is Elisa Provance. I'm from the Jewish Federation in Sacramento, California. We've had a committee on inclusion and disabilities for a few years, probably about 4 years. And really, our biggest issue, I appreciate the speakers and everything that was discussed. Our biggest issue, however, is engagement. We're a very small Jewish community to begin with, and then even lesser so of engaged and affiliated Jews. And we've had programs where sort of the same 5 families show up. We've done an educational presentation on transition, which was a little more successful because we opened it up to the non-Jewish community as well. So I'm just wondering if the speakers or perhaps somebody else on the call could advise again, with regard to smaller communities, to even find families that are impacted by disability, and just even to say that we're here as a resource, as a service. We want to work with you. We want to work on behalf of you. So I'd appreciate any guidance in that area.
Sure. First of all, we have on our website, if you go to our website, which is the RespectAbilityUSA.org, there's a section called Resources, and just scroll down to the Jewish Inclusion. You'll see a lot of resources, but you can always email me. It's Jennifer M. at RespectAbilityUSA.org, and we can speak offline. But I'll tell you that Twitter and Facebook can be very important, as is your website. Most synagogue websites do not have any pictures of people with disabilities on the website, and they don't have an inclusion policy on your website. So one thing that I would suggest, for example, is that you take this text that worked successfully. So you take the text, I'm just going to go back to the winning messages, and you take these 2 bullet points on line 21, and you can turn them into a statement about diversity in your congregation. Maybe you already have an equal opportunity statement that your congregation goes to based on race or gender or age or whatever, that you actually have an inclusion policy for your congregation, and I suggest that you actually put it on your website. And when we have these pictures that work, we have the rights to now share these pictures. So you can literally just take these pictures and put them on your website, or other pictures that might work for you, for your congregation, so that your website can look like inclusion, so that you can have inclusion and the word disability. Like when you go to your website, it's important that when you go to the search feature, if you put in the word disability, that something pops up. If nothing pops up, it tells a family member of kids with disabilities, well, this place is probably not for me. And there's a number of other tips that are on that brochure that you can click on at the end on how you can do this, about how you can connect to families. But one thing you can do is you can go to all the disability organizations. Wait, I'm trying to find where it was that we had that, the link right here, this click to the brochure here online. You literally will go to our website, and you will find access to the brochure right there. But I want to actually go back and say that you can follow people on Facebook, and you can follow people on Twitter, and then they'll start to follow you, and that can be a very good way to do it, or to engage with your public schools. And speaking of public schools, I got a great comment from Beth that I'd like to read out loud. And thanks again to the Ruderman Family Foundation for their support of our work overall. Beth writes, regarding benefits of inclusion, this example is in the secular community, but I believe it is relevant. We have data from the Boston Public Schools that kids without IEPs, that's the individualized education programs that kids with disabilities get, do better. So the kids without IEPs do better academically in schools where there is inclusion than they do in classrooms without kids with disabilities. So the findings are significant. It is believed that this is because inclusion strategies help kids needing accommodation who had not previously been identified. And actually, I read the study that she is referring to, very, very compelling data from the Boston Public School System that kids without disabilities do far better in classrooms where there are kids with disabilities with IEPs for a variety of reasons, one of which is that it means that the teachers have broken down the lesson plans to be more thoughtful, that there's more individual attention that is given based on learning by ability, and that frankly sometimes if somebody without a disability sees that the kid next to them with the disability is able to handle the work even though they may be blind or they may be a wheelchair user or may have some different social skills than they do, if that kid's able to make it, then surely I better buckle down so I can make it too. But you do see that the test scores go up of the kids without disabilities when there are kids with disabilities in their classrooms, which a lot of people thought was different than what they expected, because they thought that if you put kids with disabilities in the public school classroom, that it would cause a distraction and be a time suck for the teacher's attention, and that the kids without disabilities would suffer as a result. So it was a very important finding, and I thank you, Beth, very much for bringing that forward. Operator, are there other calls?
I think that is it for our calls.
Not at this time.
Thank you all very much for participating. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. This is meant to be a public resource for everybody who's working on these issues. Again, the photos that you saw that tested well, you can use those. The messages that tested well, and again, this was 3 times better than the messages that are being used overall. We encourage you to just copy and paste them and use them. And this brochure that we printed, feel free to take that and to put that in your own newsletters or bulletins or staff things. We are here as a resource. Anything, it's mi casa es su casa. Anything that's in our house is here for you to use. So
and
I want to say,
I'll just add for the images, for those that came from Yachad and Masorti, the correct way to give photo credit is in the PDF brochure that you can download. So if you're going to take those images, the best way to photo credit for those organizations is listed in that brochure, and so you can use that.
Right, and we have a lot more resources, as I mentioned, on the website. I want to thank Joan Alexander. I want to thank Linda Berger for just being a great partner in this and for joining us on the call. Thanks to all of you who joined us. And I hope you all are incredibly successful in your work. This concludes our call.
This concludes today's Respectability webinar. Thank you all for attending.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you.